Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!
Now you may notice that this video is taking place quite quickly after my Suikoden IV retrospective. Slightly precarious as I was averaging about a month between these titles previously. Actually, I didn't even plan on putting this project out until I completed the game in another week or so, but it only took me 20 hours to not only make it to the final boss, but easily collect all 108 stars of destiny along the way. Actually, I think that's being a bit gracious, as I'm sure at certain intervals I actually definitely left the game running when I went to go cook dinner or just kind of peruse social media. That number actually still includes about 2 to 3 hours of pure level grinding and selling around, equipment farming, stuff like that. Let me say that again. I managed to beat a Suikoden title in under 20 hours. That should be pure blasphemy any way you slice it. Suikoden IV is easily one of the biggest disappointments I've ever had in the JRPG genre in the entirety of my life. When I began my journey to play through all the mainline Suikoden titles, a certain title loomed ever ominously in the distant future, Suikoden IV. While playing through the first 3 mainline titles, I would often run across errant comments or hate towards this title on almost every front I traversed, whether it be Reddit, old Neo-Seeker, GameFAQ forums, everywhere there was somebody taking shots at Suikoden IV. As we'll discuss in depth, it seemed a great deal of the unfavorable reviews being levied at it were somewhat founded. I have to say I've never made it to the credits of any JRPG title, let alone a Suikoden title, and felt absolutely nothing, except maybe a sense of relief that it was now over. As usual, let's talk about my history with the game. Let's think back to a young KO, when I was a teenager of less than half of my current age. I remember being the only one within my friend group that was actually willing to play Suikoden IV to its completion. And if I'm being real about it, at the time I was playing it, I didn't hate it. Was it a masterpiece? Fuck no. It definitely felt like a dumbed down version of previous titles, and at that time I didn't genuinely think that there was anything offensive. I certainly wasn't left with the same level of accomplishment or slight euphoria of finishing its predecessors. It kinda just existed. It came in and went without much fanfare, and that was that. Fast forward to present day. As I've stated before in our previous retrospectives, the perspective that time gives you is a very unique thing. When revisiting JRPG titles of old, you grow to appreciate even the most unique details within the world you're traversing, or even the most obscure character lines or dialogue, which may now have completely different implications and offer you different perspective within our more keen and insightful mindset. It allows us to examine the familiar within a new set of lens, which can allow us to appreciate the story and its characters all the more. Or in the case of Suikoden IV, it can cause us to actually see the true gravity of what was not only done to this game, but to the franchise of Suikoden as a whole. Before we jump right in, if you're a fan of Suikoden content, we are on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so if you like the video, please make sure you like, comment, subscribe, give me a shout on Twitter. I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say in the comments. I want to hear what you guys like or disliked about Suikoden IV. Okay, and now on to how I feel. Suikoden IV actually killed the entire Suikoden franchise. Let's go. Okay, so for anyone new here who hasn't checked out any of the previous retrospectives, let me just say this up front. I'm not one of those YouTube nitpick artists whose desire is to absolutely deconstruct every little thing a media property has done wrong. And most importantly, I do believe in giving game developers a certain measure of grace in most cases. We'll never fully understand what conditions this development team was under during the creation of this title, so I try and measure my objectivity with that in mind. However, I do feel that it is only fair to call a spade, and as a self-professed fanboy of the series, it's only fair that we take the good with the bad. It would be absolutely hypocritical to speak of Suikoden II as the greatest JRPG of all time without acknowledging the absolute disaster that Suikoden IV ended up being. While talking about what makes the game very wrong, let's discuss what's part of the magic that made the previous titles the classics that they were. One thing that's always been the beating heart for each Suikoden title is the characters and stories that they drive. This is the main reason that the majority of players keep playing from one title to another and what made a lot of us into lifelong fans. The attention to detail and the great care that was given to each character's developmental arc throughout the narrative spoke to the deep level of passion and dedication that the creative team had during those early titles, and that tied with the meticulous attention to the intangibles gave us some of the best JRPG characters of all time. In Suikoden IV, that beating heart has been replaced with an artificial pacemaker with all the love and warmth of a literal robot. This game has some obscene obsession with going through the motions without any of the actual work being done. Everything, and I do mean everything in this game, is the most base version of the previous ideas instilled into its most basic form. In many ways, it's just a skeleton of what previously existed or a mere husk of itself. Let's discuss why. As we mentioned before, let's start off with the characters, as that's generally why 9 out of 10 Suikoden fans would generally ever get this game. There isn't a single unique version of any character in this game that hasn't been done better previously within the franchise. All previous 324 stars of destiny in previous titles handily put damn near every character to shame, with the exception of perhaps Lino, Eleanor, and Snow. None of the cast has any measure of genuine personality, that should affect the player in any genuine or hell even a comical manner. This is all the more baffling considering this is the series' introduction of voice acting, which should actually provide a more complete and immersive experience overall. Unfortunately, outside of maybe a handful of vocal performances, the majority of them fall more than a bit flat, and some of them could actually be argued to be more in line with a text-to-speech bot than an actual voice actor. For real though, tell me which one sounds better.
You're not gonna take my hide? You're not going to kill me? I feel I can trust you.
You're not going to take my hide? You're not going to kill me? I feel I can trust you.
I can only assume that the budget for this game was a fraction of previous titles, as along with its uneven voice acting, there are scenes that you fully expect to be voice acted in their totality, only to have one paragraph of dialogue spoken and the rest the player has to read. The budget seemingly was also the main reason behind one of the major issues with this game. It looks absolutely terrible at almost all times. There's no trace of the previous art style or aesthetic that was utilized from previous titles, and this was one of the main things that caused an almost constant disconnect between me and Suikoden 4. Each city and town that you travel to seem to be underneath this somewhat permanent gray filter that permeates every location. Now, while I understand why the chibi-esque style of Suikoden 3 might not have been everybody's cup of tea, at least there was a sense of color and vibrancy throughout that world. The graphical performance of this game looks a bit like a Wii or a PSP title at its very best. Actually, I think Crisis Core actually looks significantly better than this game. This is also prevalent within the game's battle animations, which might be considered the very definition of bland. Every single spell in this game looks worse than their previous counterpart, and all have lost a sense of grandness or epic scale that might have once been. This game has no visual artistic identity of its own in any way. This game feels like if I went up to a fan of Suikoden titles and asked them to create menus, UIs, world, and character models from pure memory alone. Even some of the things in this game that are supposed to look kick-ass just look absolutely ridiculous.
Helicopter, helicopter!
Most of the character models in the game are somewhat serviceable, however none offer visual flair of any type, and I found myself straight up walking past many stars of Destiny as they just look like average citizens that were virtually impossible to distinguish, and in the Suikoden title, I honestly can't think of a graver sin. For example, let's take a look at this character from Suikoden 2. He has his own unique design and starkly stands out from the remainder of the city folk, and this builds a great deal of excitement for the player to ultimately recruit this character and see what they can do on the battlefield. This is something that seldom happens in Suikoden 4, if ever. Moving on from that, let's talk about the story of Suikoden 4, which I'm not going to say is without its merits completely, but it absolutely pales in comparison to what came before it, and even outside of the Suikoden series would be considered extremely linear and disappointing by any measure. We're going to get a bit into spoilers here, so you have been warned. Let's start off with a few things that I actually did like about the story. I think the Rune of Punishment is probably one of the most intriguing of the 27 true runes that have been showcased to us thus far, and its parasitic nature and its sense of hopelessness you feel regarding the rune and the invisible timer over our hero's head was an interesting direction to take the series, and it somewhat worked. The other aspect of being framed for murder and becoming outcast was also a nice change of pace from traditional Suikoden narratives. I liked it. Okay, that's it for the stuff that I like. On to the stuff that I really hated, which is pretty much everything else. Alright, let's start with the antagonists. The Kulu Krei Trading Company are definitely the worst antagonists throughout the series so far. And 85% of the game, we literally only get to see them hash their schemes and machinations within one single static room setting. They never feel daunting or intimidating at any point throughout the entirety of the narrative, and you spend the vast majority of the game fighting nameless ship captains instead of anyone of note. And they allow the hero's party to execute their plan to recapture the southern islands with a laughable level of resistance. The entirety of the narrative never seems to move with any sense of real intention, and does a decidedly mixed job of getting the player to fall in love with this world or actually feel invested in the struggle taking place. The game moves at such a breakneck pace that by the time you reach the climax of the game, and the focus switches to you reclaiming some of the lost kingdoms, it literally feels like you just left, and it's kind of because you just did. While Graham Krei definitely has one of the best designs within the entirety of the franchise, his utilization as the game's big bad is handled in the most bizarre contrived manner at every turn. Even during his final boss fight, his dialogue and reasoning comes across as beyond lackluster, and on top of all of that, he has you fight a magic tree that actually comes out of nowhere for the game's final boss. Like seriously, why is that tree there? I need an explanation. Why? Where did it come from? The other thing that befuddles my mind is why Troy continues to side and fight with Graham after having a very obvious and sincere doubt that Graham Krei is no longer doing the bidding of the king, but serving his own ambitions. Then to top it all off, he dies in quite possibly the most pointless death within the whole Suikoden series. You see, Graham or Troy could have easily been excellent antagonists, but this half measure that was done for both of them leads to a complete narrative spaghetti situation where the game never really makes a choice as to whom the big bad will be and leads to lost potential for both characters. Honestly, they both deserve better. And all of this leads to my biggest issue with Suikoden IV, the Nameless Hero, or Laszlo if you prefer that. Going back to having a silent, nameless protagonist can only be seen as a galactic step back for everything the franchise was building towards over the last 2 titles. While Ryu did actually have some fairly comical lines, he was still the atypical silent protagonist. However, coming off the fully fleshed out characters that were Chris, Hugo, and Godot, hell, I'll even throw Thomas in there for kicks, this bright-eyed mute that we are given in this game doesn't work at all. I mean, at least his character portrait looks kick-ass, but at times even that doesn't work. Can you imagine some pissed off looking guy coming up to you and asking to buy some grapes? It's absolute hilarity. There isn't virtually a shred of character to be found or to root for as the narrative unfolds. Seriously, just a doe-eyed blank slate. There's nothing behind those eyes at all. This is probably the key component of the game that absolutely doesn't work for me at all. I just don't understand what inspired this change, or rather regression, of our title character. There are numerous other issues throughout the game's design that are equal parts confusing and frustrating, such as the ship's absolutely insane maneuverability at sea. If you think you hated Wind Waker's sailing mechanics, well boys, strap in, because the mobility offered to you at the high seas was clearly designed by an absolute masochist. This ship has all the maneuverability of a brick sailing through the air. And this, tied with the game's absolutely insane high enemy encounter rate, makes for a potent mix of both misery and endless amounts of time wasted. Like seriously, look at how many enemy encounters I had just trying to reverse the ship. That algorithm is clearly on crack. While these are the main things I consider to be the game's absolutely critical flaws that make it easily the worst entry in the Suikoden series so far, and quite likely damage the series beyond repair, I'll be starting Suikoden V on stream next week, and I've heard some grumblings that it's very much a return to form for this series. From my POV, it's still very clear to see that we never got any further mainline titles past Suikoden V, and to me, Suikoden IV was a main catalyst for the downfall of this beloved series. Even series creators have given up to create their own spiritual successor. Perhaps we'll really never know what led to this outcome that we have here today. There are many theories floating around regarding the development of Suikoden IV. I read many theories while working on this retrospective and also throughout my gameplay. A few of them. Konami was potentially just looking for a quick cash grab from one of its familiar IPs. Perhaps maybe it was the fact that the series creators had actually abandoned ship during the middle of the development of Suikoden 3, and the series no longer had a North Star to follow creatively. I'm more inclined to lean towards a more radical and potentially more hilarious premise. Suikoden 4 was created and was only a byproduct for them to produce these absolutely dreadful pachinko machines, which I'm sure made them a boatload of money, as pachinko machines are just like the house in Vegas, they always win eventually. And that's going to do it for the videos, guys. Let me know what you think about Suikoden 4 down in the comments. And if you dig Suikoden content, other JRPG retrospectives, make sure you subscribe. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. I appreciate you guys checking out the whole video. And with that being said, LC signing out. Peace.